Hello, I would like to start this video by stating that the current implementation of population growth and/or decline within EU5 is functional, that is to say it does work. Now the rest of the video will be in many ways a criticism of this implementation, but before we get into that criticism, we need to very quickly cover something known as a demographic transition model. So here it is on screen. It looks complicated, but I promise you it really isn't. The line in purple is the birth rate, simply put, how many births per woman you're having. The line in green is your death rate. That is also, I feel, pretty self-explanatory. It is the rate at which you are dying. And the line in red is hence your population. Now, the demographic transition model was not created to model demographics in EU5. Let's be clear about that. It was instead created to try and explain why we saw a big post-industrial population boom. And what the model in essence argues is that in pre-industrial societies, that is stage 1 at the bottom there, your high stationaries, we have a very high birth rate where the average woman is doing 6 or 7 children each. However, the death rate is also really high, so only 2 of those actually survive in any substantial capacity. That is to say, 4 or 5 of them are passing away. This means that population is relatively, all things considered, pretty stable at stage 1, but it's stable at a low point. Then, in the early expanding stages, we're able to get that death rate to go down significantly. That is our early industrialization, and more specifically, the benefits that come with industrialization for people not dying. That is to say, access to better medication, access to more and better food, aka the industrialization of agriculture and hence the reduction in overall famines, and of course the technological developments that coincided with the Industrial Revolution, which helped increase quality of life, and part of quality of life is also not dying early, which led to the death rate cratering. However, during this stage 2, it is important to realize that birth rate still kind of stuck near the top, as it were. That is to say, as death rates were collapsing, birth rate remained high, so population grew. At stage 3, though, the death rate, at least the collapse of the death rate, started to slow down. There were only so many improvements you can do in medication for the average person before old age and other factors started to catch up to them. Now, of course, there are still developments of that. This model is showing a very slight downward curve for death rate. I believe it's a bit more steep than that, to be fully honest, but yes, it's slowed down significantly. All of the easy improvements with things like washing your hands have already been made at this point. We only have the harder stuff to do now. However, during stage 3, we also see the collapse of birth rates. Women are no longer having 6 or 7 children, we're now moving towards the 2 or 3 children domain. It is important to realize that at this stage, population is still growing. But then you hit stage 4. At this point, the birth rate has collapsed down to the death rate and population is yet again stable. Births per woman are very low, let's say 2 to 3 in this example, but so is the death rate. Now, of course, when we look at our modern society, some people have advocated for a 5th stage, where birth rate continues to collapse, which means that we actually have a population decrease happening because of that. However, this is well beyond the scope of the video. If you want to hear me talk about history and other things outside of the scope of video games, you're going to have to go find the secret second channel for that. However, we're here to talk about EU5, and my main case is that EU5 currently models population, at least the demography of EU5, to be at stage 4 within this model, when really it should be modeled at stage 1. It could be argued historically that also within the EU4 time period, we went from stage 1 to the very start of the early expanding stage 2. After all, we do start to mess around with little bits of industrialization near the end of the campaign. However, for the most part, for I want to say until the 1750s at least, it is accurate to say that EU5 demography should be in stage 1. But EU5 demography is functional. And what's important to realize with this functionality is, of course, that in terms of modeling the population staying roughly the same, as you can see in stage 1, where the line is roughly flat, whether you're in stage 1 or stage 4, the line remaining roughly flat is kind of what you both want, expect, and need. And this is what I mean earlier when I say that the EU5 demographic system does work. However, by modeling it as a stage 4, we have a lot of issues, and I'm going to go into how they're modeling it as stage 4, and also what are the issues that come with that. So here we are in EU5. Let's click on a random province, let's select our demography, and immediately our population growth, our birth rate, is very much a stage 4 population growth. It is barely happening. 0.34% monthly population growth. I don't believe it is too controversial to say that if we are modeling this to be just amount of people born, this number should be significantly higher. And it isn't modeling just people being born, it's also modeling people dying. People should be dying to disease, people should be dying due to famines or lack of food, and people should be dying to fighting in wars and other things like that. And hence, this is why this number kind of makes a bit more sense when you look at it through that lens. This is also including the death. But herein we start to encounter the issue, because EU5 doesn't just give us a flat population number that goes up and down, it also starts to model the deaths we're taking to diseases, famines, and everything else. First of all, the food system. The food system exists, and when you start running out of food, You get famines and people start dying from lack of food. This, as you may guess, is pretty bad, so tends to be avoided, and I'm just going to ask it, if you've played EU5 for any substantial amount, I'd say a couple hundred hours, how many times have you genuinely had unavoidable famine and large population loss from famines? And I'm going to go on a limb here and say probably not. Like, maybe in a couple campaigns before you really knew what you were doing, you might have encountered famine issues. But feeding everyone in this game is frankly concerningly easy. And the outcome of that is that you basically don't end up losing population due to famine. Not really. There are no localized harvest issues. For example, a harvest failing in, say, East Anglia over here. That's absolutely fine. Harvests are universal, and in some ways, the food is perfectly distributed to everything within its market. If you're part of the London market, your access to food is unaffected by market access, as ironic as it sounds. I mean, it doesn't matter if the harvest in Anglia has been really bad, as long as the harvest in London as a whole is fine, you're fine. And this is an important factor for why there was population decline within this time period as well. Localized harvest failures were pretty common, all things considered. But also disease. And disease in EU5 does happen. Of course, you have the Black Death, and then you have other small diseases that come around and ravage your population and are terrible. But this is actually one of my points to where the system starts to break down. It is, of course, the modeling of that diseases. Because let's take another quick tangent and let's now talk about cities. Cities in EU5 are a great place for growing population because compared to rural locations, which for the record, rural locations do get an extra 0.10% from rural settlement location rank, but a city, like the City of London here, well, it tends to get buffed to population capacity. And the other factor we have to realize is that in EU5, the way they've modeled population, there just tends to be more people living in cities, which is fine. But because it is modeled as a percentage growth in every single province, the optimal way to grow a population is to shove as many people into one city as you possibly can, then go to your cabinet, assign a person on expelling population who's good at military. There you go, expel people, and expel them from London. So what's going to happen is you get a bunch of migration out, but it's made up for by the fact that you have a lot of population growth, because getting even 1% pop growth on like 100k pops is actually very good. And this is very stupid because historically, cities were not good for population growth. Now, cities had a very high population. That is because they had a lot of economic opportunities, so people would migrate into cities for work. However, we need to realize, and let's pull up the demographic model yet again. For the vast majority of human history, in stage 4 and stage 1 societies, cities were a net negative on population growth. That is because in stage 1, one of the big contributing factors to death rate was disease. And cities, pre-industrialized medication, pre-sewers, pre all of these developments, are just the perfect breeding ground for diseases, meaning that disease rates within cities were incredibly high, and this is why the nobility, or those that had, shall we say, the means to do so, would escape to the countryside. But that's in stage 1. In stage 4, cities are even worse for population growth. Now, the death rate is under control a bit more. Yes, the countryside is still healthier and safer to live in terms of disease. You are exposed to less diseases and hence survive more on average, because if you say have a 1% death chance from every disease you're exposed to, in a city you're just exposed to more of them, so statistically you're more likely to perish from that. But the other factor is, of course, within cities now, is that living in cities is expensive. This has always been true. But this now hurts the birth rate. Now, of course, nothing is stopping you having 5 children in the city, and nothing is stopping you having just 1 child in the countryside, if even. However, we also have to recognize that on average, we do have lower birth rates within cities, and this is what matters here. Basically, for the most part, cities are a drain on human population, and the only reason they have high populations is because of migration into said cities. Returning to EU5, we have some hilarious implications, though, within how the game models diseases and populations. Because first of all, yes indeed, population growth is better in cities because you just have more pops that are having a higher percentage increase of population. However, cities are just significantly better at dealing with diseases than rural environments. Why is that? Well, every single province in the game has a base disease resistance, that is to say, of 0%. Now, of course, this isn't universally true. There are base levels of resistance within societies. That is to say, for example, in the New World, you do not have resistance to the Great Pestilence, that is to say, the old world diseases. And if your capital is in Africa, you are immune to malaria, which is obviously how that works, indeed. However, in general, the base disease resistance stats are kind of flat all around. As you can see, this rural location has 35% on non-immune diseases like Great Pestilence, but Tunis has, as you may have guessed here, 35% as well, despite the fact that Tunis is a city. But this is where the divergence happens. Hospitals provide, for example, plus 10% disease resistance. This is great, but hospitals, well, you need to have more than 20 development. You can only build them in urban locations, in towns and cities. And especially as you play later into the game, and you start unlocking new disease-resistant buildings like this Lazaretto, sounds very Italian. Nevertheless, this gives you 25% disease resistance, an excellent boost, but you can only build them in cities and towns on the coast for some reason. This means that as you play the game and you start getting more and more of these disease resistant buildings that can only apply to urban locations, rural locations become disease death traps where, because there's no access to hospitals or anything of that nature, everyone just dies to diseases. But urban locations have access to hospitals, they have access to these lazarettos, they get access to more buildings later into the game, and that means that they become pretty much immune to diseases. This creates a really stupid metagame, where if you want to keep rural locations, you in essence almost have to surround them by cities with high disease resistance, otherwise the diseases will just ravage these rural areas and absolutely decimate their population. Which is really, really stupid. That's not how that works at all. Now, a ridiculously simple fix to this would be just to allow you to build hospitals in rural areas. But I say a better fix would be just to give rural areas an insanely high disease resistance, just based for being rural, like 90% or something stupid, and then let them build hospitals as well as if you really want. Just don't let you hit 100% disease resistance, right? But make cities like super more vulnerable to diseases and make towns also vulnerable but not that vulnerable. So there is a scaling count as you urbanize, you get a bigger, shall we say, population drain on you from more people living closer to each other and hence diseases being more of a thing, forcing you to invest in hospitals or just tanking the population impact of doing so. But this brings us to the other part of the game. Because the game has taken the liberty of calculating both the population growth and the population decline for you, when population declines do happen, they feel particularly punishing. Now, the Black Death did take a while for everyone in Europe to recover from, in some cases 100 to 200, even 300 years, but that was not helped by, shall we say, good policy from the rulers. People would constantly go to war and have a large impacts of warfare on diseases, on just frankly famine neglect, where large areas would be starving and the kings would not do anything about that. But it also meant that those that did worry about their populations and encouraged their population recovery and looked after their people were rewarded with, you've guessed it, more productive and larger populations. But this just doesn't happen in EU5, removing that as an avenue of gameplay. But also, it means that when population loss does happen from diseases, from warfare, from things like that, it feels extra punishing. And elements of this lead to Paradox nerfing diseases in very stupid ways, like giving everyone in Africa 100% resistance to malaria. This is really stupid. The only reason they have to do this is that if they don't give them 100 resistance to malaria, everyone in Africa is going to die to malaria, because it's a pretty brutal disease. In essence, this 100% resistance to malaria is a band-aid fix on the fundamental issue that population growth is way, way, way too low. But then I hear you say, okay, if you up population growth and make local famines more brutal so population can decrease down a lot, what stops people as England getting populations to say 20 million super early on? Well, for that, I'm going to have to say we have to address another mechanic that already exists in the game, but is just frankly underutilized entirely. When was the last time you've seriously considered population capacity? Well, I'm actually going to make the pitch that in 1337, before the Black Death, the vast majority of the world should be sitting near to or at population capacity. Because what population capacity should be representing, and it's going to sound really stupid, but the carrying capacity of how many people can live in this province. With our current technological abilities to grow food, with our current technological abilities of dealing with diseases, and with our current ability to, well, have enough, dare I say, employment for people to not starve or work in the current land, how many people can live in Harrow, for example? How many people can live in Kingston? How many people can live in London? And the answer is, according to EU5, 743,000 people in London in 1337. No, they can't. This number should be ridiculously lower, and it should be substantially increasable through technologies and infrastructure projects like building sewers, building aqueducts if you are Byzantibu, right? All of these developments, and especially increases in agriculture, should lead to substantial increases in this population capacity. And because we are modeling everything as a stage 1, not as a stage 4, reaching this population capacity should be significantly easier because base rates of population growth should be significantly higher, like 3, 4, 5% per month instead. However, at the same time, this needs to be balanced through really, really brutal diseases. Warfare needs to be much more brutal on local population, and local famines and starvation, and even just frankly food management, which is in the game, but it's been nerfed significantly. I'm not sure if some of you may remember this from a previous video, but I had talked about playing EU5 earlier on during its development cycle and how much I had to deal with food. Yeah, they just buff food production everywhere so much that food is almost trivial as a mechanic now. I'm not saying go back to those periods. I'm saying go back to those periods and make it even harder. Make food an entire ordeal to go through, but also make increasing the food production of the local province directly contribute to this population capacity. Because at the current system, the fish being caught in Colchester at a zero cost to the government or everyone else is turned into food, which is very comfortably and again at zero transportation cost fed to the copper miners of Truro, and that's just fine. It would also make diseases, warfare, and those kind of things inherently less punishable if population can be recovered, and I think would genuinely add to quite an interesting part of the gameplay itself, building up domestic infrastructure not just to increase an arbitrary control value, but to also aid in the distribution of food and distribution of, shall we say, living standards to your population. Although I will admit saying it as distribution of living standards is a bit unhinged. Can this implementation be messed up? Absolutely. But it will also let you get rid of a bunch of band-aid fixes, like, for example, yet again, the 100% resistance to malaria that African nations have, but also Europeans should not be 100% resistant to the Great Pestilence. The Great Pestilence is meant to be modeling the big European diseases that came over to the New World, but they came over to the New World because people in the Old World were suffering from them, right? In 1337, we did not cure all of these diseases that are mentioned within this list of great pestilence. They were still affecting the local population. Yes, to a lesser extent, but they were still affecting it. At the moment, this is abstracted away into this demographic population growth being implicitly decreased. But it doesn't have to be. We can get rid of this abstraction. We can let the people in Europe and Africa and everyone else actually still keep dying of diseases. We just need to get rid of this weird abstraction step where population growth also includes people dying of a famine, even if your market is full of food and also there is fine food everywhere. And I mean, yes, I mentioned this before, but I think it also is just a good way of leading to emergent gameplay, right? Populations and fluctuations in population leading to certain developments and seeing that, oh, there's been a big disease outbreak in France, their population has dipped, but will recover soon. Maybe now is a good time to go to war is, in my opinion, an interesting element of this game that is just not explored and really could be. With that all being said, that is unfortunately all the time I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching, with a special thank you to all my channel members, especially Ark, Soda, Solemn, Lord Zendika, Nick Huston, Hatan, Star72, The Awesome Rabbit, Best for Gaming, Grabble, Flavia, Labarule, WH Solve, Anthony35, AC Napo, Conspiracy Pizza, Yukata, Danray, Marley Jack, Ryland, Stuart Allen, Andrew Black, Nebula, Centronic, Twinet, and Aquabird.